Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to this week's edition of Imperial as One's Belonging series, where we explore the lived experience of individuals from the Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds. And every week I say this, and every week I mean it, is that we've got a really special guest with us. We share each other's stories, we hear each other's experiences, and we learn so much. And I'm gonna be honest. When I had my conversation with our guest, our prep conversation, I was just blown away. So I know that we're in for a really big treat today. So I'm gonna stop procrastinating and I'm going to get on with what everyone's come in to see. So our guest today is Priscilla Reddy, Professor Priscilla Reddy. And I've called her a behavioral scientist working in the fields of HIV and AIDS and looking at tobacco control and adolescent health in South Africa. But she is so much more. And I know she's going to go into that with us right now. So Priscilla, I just want to say a very thank you for being our guest today. I'm going to kick off by asking my usual question, which is, can you tell me a little bit about what it was that helped you to get your sense of identity, your sense of belonging as you were growing up? Give us a little bit about your background, your history.
Well, my history is an interesting history for anybody, including myself, because I essentially grew up in apartheid South Africa. During the thick of apartheid. So my family, my grandmother and her mother came to South Africa as indentured laborers, right? Another word for slavery. It's a prettier word, I guess.
Yeah.
So they were indentured for about 5 to 10 years until they were freed. And then my grandmother married her husband, my grandfather, who sadly died at the age of 35 from TB, which was absolutely common at that time. But they moved to a rural town called Howick. And that's important because my grandfather was able to speak English.
Right.
And because he was able to speak English, he was employed as some kind of low-level person by the borough of Howick. So our history, the Reddy family history, really, besides them arriving on the ship and all of that, and that pre-10 years, the history that I know and I've lived is the history starting in Howick. So I went to a segregated school, during apartheid, the Group Areas Act divided people into African Black, so-called colored, white people, and people of Indian descent.
Right.
And I think there was some other category of honorary white people. I'm not sure about that category, but I think they might have been Japanese or something. So my grandmom had a house in a white area, and it was called, and it was a beautiful house because I went there when my dad died, and we kind of stayed in that area. We hired an Airbnb there because we had the funeral back in the village, that we grew up in. So they had a beautiful house in Mare Street. Separate legislation came. They were moved now to a town called Howick West, designated for people of Indian descent.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think they were given small pieces of land where they could put up a shack, which my grandmother did with all her children. And then as my dad started working in the BTR, British Tire and Rubber Company, the later South African Samco, as all the boys started working there, and they were able to buy a piece of land. And then we moved from the tin house into a proper brick house, which is the place I grew up in, and went to a primary school designated for Indians.
Mm-hmm.
And it was horrible, actually, because the Indian school was a decent school. It was decent because all our parents got together, put money, and so it was called a government-aided school, and they built the school. And then the African school down the road, which I frequented because a nurse that lived there was an African Black woman, and she was friends with my mom. So I used to go there regularly, and I could see there was just like this one big room, and those kids had a black slate and a white chalk, and they used to write on that, and we had books. And that was always an issue for me. So at the end of the year, when we finished with our books and had loads of pages left, I used to say to my mom, why can't we tear these pages out and give it to that school? And she would say things like, do you want us to go to jail? You know?
Oh.
Yeah. So so that's my growing up history. Even high school, I went to school designated for Indians. And university, there was a university designated for Indians, University of Durban, Westville, which I think my father in particular preferred me not to go to. And the choice of career meant that they didn't have that degree. So I figured out that I could get a permit to go to the white university.
Mm-hmm.
And I got a permit.
How did you get the permit?
Okay, so yeah, that's very interesting. And no one ever talks about that. And in fact, we need to document that because I think people forget that. And so basically, you select a course. My best friend at high school, Narissa Ann Naidu, she chose CAGO, Comparative Government and African Law, which was not offered at the Indian University. And I chose a Bachelor of Science in Nursing, which was not offered at the Indian University. That meant we could apply for a permit if our marks were good enough, our scores were good enough to go to the white university. And that's how I got to the University of Cape Town.
So it was almost like you had to have a course which couldn't be taught in a local school, for one, and two, have grades which were good enough to enable you to go in. So it was almost like a scholarship, although it was not a scholarship. It's not.
It was like a special permission. You were somehow different. The CAGO was a big deal. I think BSc nursing wasn't such a big deal, but CAGO was a big deal. And Narissa was that way inclined, the humanities inclined, whereas I was more science inclined. So the only science degree that would have been available to me was a Bachelor of Science in Nursing, because the majors were nursing and physiology.
Right, okay. So based on what you said before, your father worked in a rubber factory. Your mother also kind of like worked as a kind of like ironing and things like that.
My grandmother did ironing.
Grandmother, yeah. How was education viewed in your family? What was it seen as? Was it a vehicle? How did they view your education? What you could do?
Yeah, that's a really intuitively important question, because look, my dad worked at the rubber factory. He got TB, pneumonia, chest infections. It was tough work. His brothers, that night shift drove them to drinking. So a lot of, unfortunately, the older men in the family drank a bit heavily, more than we wanted them to, which was heartbreaking for my grandmother. So it was very clear that sorry, I didn't realize this. No, it's not. Oh, sorry about this.
It's all right.
Let me just take it away. Sorry, I'm in a hotel room. So sorry.
No,
yeah. So basically, look, my mom was a housewife, whatever that meant, right? And gardening and planting vegetables and selling that kind of thing, and maybe baking and cooking and selling that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And my dad worked in the rubber factory, so did all my uncles. And, we lived in extended families to make the penny go further.
Yeah.
And so that was my dad's generation. Now, for the cousins, all the brothers and sisters' children, there was one adage, and my mom was absolutely, she would not compromise on that. You had to get educated, because they could take everything away from you, but not your education.
Right. So from your dad's experiences and your mum's experiences, they recognized, or they instilled in the next generation, you guys are going to get educated. We can see education as a pathway. They can take everything else from you, but they can't take your education from you. So yourself, your siblings, your cousins, did everybody enter into that mindset? It wasn't an option?
Well, the older female cousins had great difficulty, anybody older than me, 10, 15 years older than me. And the reason they had difficulty is there were no universities for them to go to. The boys went to the famous Forte University, but that was hell. They had to sleep on the floor. They had to slaughter sheep once a month for food. So the older girls were not put through that.
Right.
So it was like, in fact, if I think about it, in my generation, I'm probably the first or second cousin with tertiary education.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm probably, there's one more. She's a couple of years older than me, like 5 or 6 years older, and she became a lawyer and she went to the university, UDW. So in the cousins. So from the cousins, it's Kalyani, who's a lawyer, and me. Yeah, from the girls.
From the girls. So the boys kind of like had an easier, I'm not going to say easier path, they had a rough path as well, but there was a provision that they could go off to go to university easier than the girls seemed to. Is that right?
Yeah, because they were willing to, how to put this, they were willing to rough it out.
Right. So coming back to your education then, how was it for you being at the University of Cape Town? How was that for you as a young woman? What was the experiences that you had? Were they welcoming? What was the challenges that you faced?
It's not nice to say this, but it's important to speak the truth.
Mm-hmm.
My experience at the University of Cape Town was very unpleasant.
Right.
Was very, very unpleasant. There was absolutely no sense of welcome or belonging. I kind of felt an outsider. The Albert Camus, I kind of felt the outsider right through. I never did well at university, at undergraduate. Everything was always hard. I was always getting into trouble because I was a political activist, and you shouldn't really be that. You're supposed to be a good girl. You're supposed to be grateful for being there. So my UCT experience, sadly to say, was rather a denigrating experience. It was, when I finished, I had zero confidence. I just felt like a lazy, bad person who was stupid.
Wow. So from when you finished your secondary education, with all those aspirations ahead of you to go into nursing and everything, 3 or 4 years at this university institution had left you feeling dejected, lazy, not worth, sucked out your self-esteem or your
Absolutely, that's a good way. It definitely sucked out my self-esteem, and I didn't even think I was a good nurse. I wouldn't dare go to a hospital. I mean, I was working at Grooterskloof Hospital, which was the best hospital in the world, really, but I was not going to apply for a post there. So I applied for a post to do school nursing, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and that catapulted me into where I am right now, because I realized that primary healthcare, prevention, etc., was about behavior change. And even there, I tried to do a master's degree at the University of Cape Town, but it was only for people who had completed an MB-CHB, that's the medical degree, and not for me. So there was a wonderful Black professor there who said, Priscilla, you need the methodology, come and sit in these classes, but you can't take the exam. And like after 1 month, I thought, what is this? Nonsense, I'm not going to do this. Absolutely nonsense, and he would give me the tests. I would take them at home, and they were not difficult, and I figured I could do it. So then I applied for a Fulbright scholarship and went to the United States. And that's where there was a 360-degree change.
So tell me about this Fulbright scholarship, just to make sure that everybody understands what that Fulbright scholarship enabled you to do.
Well, it was very interesting that the Fulbright was awarded because I did not have good marks at all. I mean, if I was on that panel, I don't know how I would have perceived it, but there were interviewers from the United States and the interviewers from South Africa. And I remember the guy still, I don't know where he's now, that was interviewing me, kind of figured out what I probably went through, And so even without the good marks, you had to do the GRE and the GMAT and everything, and all that was done. And I figured, at the time, there were two things happening. People were going to join the military ANC outside of the country, or people were going to study. And I never, ever had the guts for a military kind of pursuit.
Right.
And so I didn't even think about that. I just looked for every scholarship. I wrote to various institutions here as well. Nothing came through. And then when the Fulbright came through, I was terrified that I wouldn't get a visa, I wouldn't get a passport to leave the country. I did struggle to get my first passport. It was really, it was some really tense days, but then I got it and I left. And I went for 18 months to Amherst, Massachusetts, and was mentored by the most wonderful human beings.
I'm just before we go across to the US, there's just one thing that I'm still very interested in. There's lots of things, but the thing which you mentioned about your old supervisor, the one who said, you can't take the test, but I'll allow you to sit in on the class. Did they give you any further encouragement? Because that sounds like they must have seen something in you to allow you even to sit in on the class, even though you weren't allowed to take the test. It's just out of curiosity, I'm just wondering.
And no, interestingly not. There was no encouragement.
Okay.
I mean, he was too senior. I was just a very junior person. I didn't have many interactions with him except go to his class and listen to the lectures and learn. But there was no, he later on in life, he did play another role in my life, which I'll talk about later. But at that time, no. In fact, nobody encouraged me to go. There was a lot of tension about leaving the country and where you were going to and all of that.
So I'm going to just tease a little bit more then, because if you didn't have any kind of like role models in front of you there to say to you, you can try and apply for this scholarship and you can try and apply for this. What was that motivation that kept you going despite all of these things? What was it that was motivating you to say, you know what, there's something out there with my name on it?
First of all, I was intrigued by research.
Right.
Second of all, I did not want to work as a clinical nurse.
Right.
I just didn't want to do that. And thirdly, I mean, it was an undergraduate degree. So I wanted to get out of the undergraduate degree situation into a more learned situation. Right. And the next step, I mean, if you go to university, you're not going to stop at an undergraduate degree, are you? You're going to pursue the next, the next, and the next, and the next. And I was particularly interested in data. And I was working in some terrible circumstances, and there was just no evidence. There was no data on Black school kids, Black school kids meaning white, colored, Indian, and Black. So I was really interested in, and I had other friends who were doing microbiology, who were doing sports science, and they managed to get into the master's programs because they were in different departments. Okay. So it was the context, and it was not wanting to stay at the bottom. Fantastic. Not that there's anything wrong with an undergraduate degree, but that's where you were going to be. That's where you were going to be with that low salary, and
Yeah. So it was about you. So even though you said that you came out of university not necessarily having it had drained you, yeah, that element of going and practicing as a school nurse, getting that bug for the research and accumulation of data, that was then what helped to propel you to say, I can do more. There's more to be found out, and I can do more. Yes. And then winning the scholarship as well. Tell us about the scholarship in the US. So getting across to America, in Massachusetts, what happened there? How was that revolutionary for you?
It was completely revolutionary. The first 3 weeks we spent at the American University in Washington, D.C., with Fulbright scholars from all over the world. It was literally like being in a student camp of the United Nations. So that was really exciting, really fulfilling. And it was also interesting to meet people from Peru, people from other developing countries. And then I went from there, you went straight to your university, where you were registered. And I entered the School of Public Health, and I chose to major in health education, health promotion, and behavioral science. And the professors that I, the classes I chose, everybody was really, really intrigued by South Africa. And they were so happy to have a South African student. So the first time in my life, I felt like I had a brain in my head and that I could do it academically, that this was possible. And I ended up with a 3.9 grade point average. And, I just thoroughly enjoyed it. And interestingly enough, all the profs who mentored me were white men.
Okay.
So for me, that was a big tension, because that's not what I expected. That's not what I wanted. That's not what I thought would happen. I don't know if I had any thoughts, and they were just the nicest men. So it's amazing how this whole concept of racism works, because once I became the top student in the class, and they were so good to me, I actually did not see them as white men.
Right.
I honestly did not, whereas in South Africa, that would hit me first. I saw them as American.
Yeah. So you had almost gone through a kind of like a transitional, your viewpoint of whiteness, as it were, or the powers associated with whiteness had not slightly changed, but you recognized that it wasn't so, for want of better words, it wasn't so black and white. Yeah,
it wasn't so black and white. It wasn't. And then I also made friends with, most of my friends were either from Africa or the African American community. And it was just very, very sad to hear, their experiences, because their experience in America was the same as mine in South Africa. And now I was coming here as a Black South African and having a different experience. And they would always, all my friends would always caution me. And I can remember we were having a dinner, it was in Atlanta, and we were talking about this. And I almost felt guilty at the time. And I had to find a way to kind of justify myself. And, I had to point out that the people I was talking about was Al Winder, David Buchanan, Jesse Ortiz. These were, there has to be a place where there's a one-to-one, there's a one-to-one acknowledgement rather than everybody. Yeah. So I learned at that time, it was so much learning, the classroom was just one thing. I learned at that time that you can't paint everybody with one brush. Right. And for me, it was, and then you go back to South Africa and what? It's one brush again. It doesn't change. In fact, now you're a threat because you're now an educated Black. Before you were at the bottom, and even liberal people had, you looked up to these, to the white people you were working with and who were on your side, because in your mind, they were good people, they're giving up all this to fight for the people. And then when you go back, it was a very, very tricky 18 months when I went back from America. It was not pleasant, it was tricky. And then thank God, I registered for a PhD at Maastricht University. And again, my profs were gay, they were white men, they were wonderful, ever so encouraging, and seeing it from afar. And I can remember Gerio saying, there are not many countries where when I travel, I'm very proud to be Dutch, is what he said at my PhD ceremony. I'm very proud to be Dutch. But when I come to South Africa, I don't want to say I'm Dutch.
Wow.
And he said this at my PhD dinner celebration.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because it's the connotations of heritage, it's the connotation of what your forefathers have done and what they're continuing, or people of your descent are still continuing to do in the, I'm assuming, in the oppression of other people. So it's
a majority, and the thing is, it's of a majority of people.
Yeah.
This is why in my mind I'm gonna have to keep clicking a switch, because it's BAMEs here, but at home it's the majority of people.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And so, yeah, it's a really strange, not strange concept, because you understand that it's those differences and the way in which people perceive you have an impact on the way in which you can exist, the way in which you can feel as though you belong or you don't belong. You know, so even when you were in America or when you were in Maastricht in the Netherlands, did you have a greater sense of belonging, greater sense of identity compared to when you were in South Africa?
Well, in America, I was, I'd walk into a class and feel totally comfortable and relaxed. There wasn't that withhold, that little bit of fear, that feeling uncomfortable and thinking I'm not good enough. I never felt that. During my PhD and during my master's, I never felt that once. But my identity, both in America and Maastricht, was South African Black. And in America, it was very confusing because I look the way I look. For African Americans, you're not Black. So that was a bit of a hurdle, but it was such a small thing, I didn't care.
Right. So I'm just wary of time, as I always am, and we've got so much to cover. And this is going to be an extended version for those who are in here with us. We're going to go on a little bit longer because there's just so much to cover. But Priscilla, tell me about when you came back. You already said about how challenging it was when you came back from the US, and then you went off to do your PhD. And then when you came back from your PhD, how was that experience? And what were you aiming? What were you trying to achieve now coming back with your PhD in hand? What kind of change?
Okay, well, here's the difference. Here's what you're going to be surprised by now. So when I wanted to do a PhD, my boss was a very nice guy, white epidemiologist. I was restless. I was very restless. I was working in the AIDS program. I did not want to do epidemiology. I wanted to do behavioral science. So after 3 or 4 months, I said I wanted to do a PhD. And he spent an hour discouraging me.
Wow.
1 hour discouraging me. I remember going home and saying to my dad, can you believe it? This guy spent 1 hour discouraging me. My father said, that makes sense because they need you to work in the unit. They hired you, they need your skills. That's why he's discouraging you. So I just ignored my dad as well, because that's not what the answer I wanted. So I had already spotted this Maastricht program and behavioral science and everything. So I applied and I got a fellowship to go to Maastricht. And then, interestingly enough, Harry said to me, I didn't mention the PhD because it was very intimidating. It was an incredibly intense course, academically very intimidating. It's quite different to what I did in the States as well. But at the same time, also very provocative, very interesting, very, wow, we need this in South Africa. So at the end, I was talking with Harry, and I hadn't even mentioned the PhD. He said, you know what, I think you should do a PhD with us. One sentence. Wow. One sentence. A person of very few words.
Wow.
And that's how it started. And then, of course, I didn't have money. And so we tried to get a Woodrow Fellowship, but South Africa was still embargoed at that time. So, those fellowship got delayed. So what happened was we figured out a way, because the Dutch methodology enables it, for me to stay in South Africa, do the research work, go regularly to Maastricht, do the coursework, do the data analysis like across the sea.
Yeah.
And that's what I did, because now, we were 98, 99, 2000. things were really, really changing fast. The government needed every skill they had. And they needed me in tobacco control, behavior and legislation. In fact, I turned down a job, a very fancy job in government, director of health promotion, because I wanted to finish the PhD. And that was the best thing I'd ever done, I think. So I did my PhD combined South Africa and Maastricht, and I worked in tobacco control with the left hand, and the right hand was sexually transmitted infections and related behaviors. So I didn't leave home for more than 3 or 4 months a year.
Right. Okay. So
I'd go regularly, because by now I had the Woto Fellowship, which enabled finances to travel up and down.
Right. So it was you'd be a very good person for some of our younger listeners to discuss about getting fellowships and the difficulties and the kind of things that they need to include to make sure that they're successful. But in having those fellowships and being able to then get your PhD kind of like across the continents, as it were, because in Africa, in South Africa, and then also in the Netherlands, in Europe, you must have developed a lot of skills about transformation, about what was it then that following on from your PhD, you saw?
Well,
go ahead.
Following on from my PhD, I was as determined as anything that other people have this experience. Right. So I had hardly finished my PhD when I'd already talking to Bart and Ferrio saying, yeah, I'm almost done now, but there's so-and-so and there's so-and-so and there's so-and-so and there's so-and-so. So they said, well, Priscilla, you're going to need decent data. Your data set was a phenomenal data set, was very interesting, exciting, and it was very good for Maastricht University. And that's all they had to say, because then I figured all I had to do was write grants in an ethical way. And the say I had a 4-year grant on evaluation of a school-based HIV intervention. Yeah, that was probably one of the first grants I had. And there was a woman working with me, and I talked with her, and she was super keen to do her PhD. So I said, okay, we'll appoint you as the director of the study, not a research assistant or my assistant. I'm the PI, but you'll be the director of the study. I will work with you, but you're going to run the study. And I will not drop you at any point. I'll be there all the time, but the study is going to be your responsibility. And so she published 5 papers and did her PhD. And that's how I trained 16 or 17 Black PhDs in South Africa. And again, I was probably, criticized because I was training these people overseas and not in South Africa. But in my mind, in my opinion, South Africa did not have those skills. They had epidemiology, statistics, public health. That was great, but not behavioral science.
Right. So you recognize that within the country at that time, they didn't have the necessary skill set to enable you to do the kind of analysis, do the kind of research, which was actually necessary to affect behavioral change, which is what was needed in the society at the time. And so,
and it was hard for the Medical Research Council, which was largely invested in biomedical research, epidemiology, and statistics, to realize and figure out the intensity of behavioral science. And for many of those people, I don't know what they thought it was. I was once described by one of the directors as a little nurse who does research on comic books. And I had just developed an intensive photonovela using methodology from South America and Canada, where you get children to read through these very structured photonovelas. And for him, that was like buying a trashy journal or magazine or something, I think. But it was interesting because that told me you don't belong here. Yeah. It made me scared. I was very scared when I heard that, because I thought, oh God, they're going to shut my unit down, which they eventually did actually. And, I was really worried about that. But I quickly partnered with the equivalent of the Imperials. I didn't partner with Imperial, but with Maastricht University, with Massachusetts, with Michigan, with Emory, and got visiting positions at those schools, which was wonderful, and was able to write these big grants in collaboration with American investigators. And I can remember at one of the evaluations of my unit, which was a very tough process, I kind of joked, well, we don't work with international people if they haven't written the textbook. So it took a lot of spunk as well, to keep it going. And the unit started off as the Health Promotion Research and Development Office, and then it became a fully fledged MRC unit where I became a director. And that's when William Pick comes into play again, because he came in as acting president of the Medical Research Council. And he said, Priscilla, what is the salary? And I just looked at him. He said, but haven't you asked? I said, come on. And he changed my salary to be what it should have been. But I'd already lost 10 years of a pension scheme, a medical aid scheme, et cetera, et cetera. And the guy that implemented that is still there. He's still there.
So I'm going to just try a little bit. You may not know, you may know, you may have ideas about it. But do you think, well, it might be a rhetorical question either as well. Do you think it was because you were a woman, because you were a Black woman, why your salary wasn't deemed to be that it should be the same as your other counterparts in your unit?
Well, first Black,
yeah,
and then woman. Yeah, first Black and then woman. And then I wasn't a medical doctor. I think somewhere that was also used. But then I had a terminal degree, which was a PhD. An MBCHP is an undergraduate degree, which is what I said to them.
Yeah. So they were categorizing you and preventing you from actually not achieving, but they weren't rewarding you in what you should have achieved, should have had, because of factors which you've already outlined. Yeah.
And the thing is, I guess, it's one of the things that would have made me leave, right? Because after all that work, you're earning a horrible salary. I'm sure those numbers are still, we could find those numbers. You're earning a horrible salary and you'd leave, but I wasn't going to leave because that was the place to be. And that was where we could get grants. And that was where I hired all these young people and catapulted their PhDs, and anybody doing a PhD knows what a lonely experience it is. So I constantly had to have two people doing a PhD at the same time, because then they could support each other. Because for them, these were Black kids that never had exposure, that in fact not never had exposure, that were deliberately kept away from exposure.
But I'm still trying. I think I already know, but your mindset seemed to be so different to many of the people who were in your unit. You were there trying to open up the space to welcome people in, whereas it sounds as though many of the others who were in the same unit as you were almost trying to close it down, keep the status quo.
Oh yeah, the status quo, it's very, very important for the status quo to stay. Because it's like the last custodian of colonialism and apartheid, if I may say so, Yeah.
So
I mean, they would let a few people in. Don't get me wrong. There was a group of people that would be let in, but yeah, they were different,
So tell me how, with some of your students that you had, right? With some of the students that you had, what was it that you necessarily saw in them? What was it that you wanted them to be able to have compared to kind of like, what experience is it that you wanted them to have compared to what you had had?
So let's take two studies. Let's take the one study of developing and testing an HIV prevention intervention for prisoners, for inmates, because Mandela had just come out of prison. So we were all tough. We were all like it was on our radar. So I got an NIH grant together with a wonderful investigator called Professor Ron Braithwaite from Emory. We were co-PIs. And then I had to find an African Black male to run the study. And that speaks for itself, right? So I made a few phone calls and I advertised, but I made lots of phone calls because in the interview, I had to say to them that I have an expectation for the candidate to engage and register with a PhD overseas. It didn't mean that they would have to leave home, but it came with its own tensions. And I told them it was very, 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 very difficult. I really told them how difficult it was. So if they wanted to give up, they must give up now at the interview spot. And then Sibu came along, he's Professor Sifunda now. He was just finishing a master's at UCT in epidemiology and having great difficulty in finishing his PhD, his master's, for whatever reason. But what I did was I got my colleagues from the Netherlands to help him finish the statistics on that master's. So Sibu turned out to be the perfect candidate for that study in just so many ways. Published like, I don't know, 8 papers, and he worked so well with the American team. After a while, it was Sibu, that whole thing was just Sibu's thing. I'd be called in to do the high level things. And then, with developing the research instruments and everything, obviously, I'd have to play a role. But so Sibu was not my assistant. He was a research director of that study, which I'm sure did something for his morale. And we caused a complete ruction at the MRC because we had to employ ex-prisoners, and they stayed in the MRC's little house at the back, and people freaked out. People really, really freaked out, and that's where the flack started, actually. But these guys were released from jail. They were committed. We interviewed them carefully. They needed a dignified place to stay, a place where the bed had a white bed sheet and a pillow and a decent blanket, and not staying in some little hole that was cold and miserable. So, my attitude was, well, if you bring white people and put them here, you can put these guys here. And those were brave things you had to do. And, obviously, I had to make some compromises, like I had to tell everybody when, so they wouldn't have other guests there, a couple of things that really went against the grain. But Sibu said, sis, just do it. Just do it. We'll tell them we're using this place. We'll pay and hire out the whole place for those 2 weeks. But Sibu, it's wasting our budget. We don't need the whole place. We need 3 rooms. He says, sis, but they're just not going to agree. You just have to agree to this. And then I signed and we paid for those rooms for that whole time, the whole place. So that it was our black guys only.
So, as you described that story, what came to mind was the fact that it was almost like you were constantly in battle.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. My daughter says that now. She said, I don't want to be like you. I don't want to be a strong black woman. I don't want to be in a battle. I don't want to be all these things. I want to be like Auntie Priya. I want to have a good life. That's a friend of mine who's flying everywhere and staying in wonderful places.
But I understand that, but it's through your battle that, as you said, you've had at least 16 to 18 PhD students who have gone through, got their PhDs, who are now leaders in industry where they are because of the training that they've received from you. And
they are good scientists. They are good. They can stand up and defend their data, These are people that couldn't write English, like myself. We struggled with writing good scientific English. But, you have to make it happen. The methods you use, At some point, I got people who couldn't do well with prepositions and verbs to read children's books because it was so clear and so simple. So, you could transform your sentence based on that. And after a couple of months, you get it,
Yeah.
I never told anybody it's going to be easy.
It sounds to me you became a kind of like, you were a director. And one of the things which you said, and you've said it about 2 or 3 times, is that you didn't necessarily call them PhD students, even though they were. You called them the director of studies. So you
and there was a reason for that as well. Because remember, this was 2000. The majority of the people were white there. I didn't want them pushing my staff around, oh, that's just the student. I'm sure students would identify that, oh, it's just the students. You know, I wanted them to have a space, respect, because they had to train, because in my mind, these were the future directors in science, certainly in behavioral science, future directors in public health. So it was the soft science around the content. For me, the content was easy. It was all that stuff, that belonging stuff that you're talking about, that was the hard stuff.
So, no, I just love that, because to me, that's empowering. That's actually empowering. It's safeguarding, as you said, but it's also empowering because it's the image, it's that double consciousness.
It's absolutely the double consciousness,
yeah. If somebody's telling you that you are a director of study, then you're going to, we would hope you're going to take on that mantle. I am the director of this study. So you're empowering them to go above and beyond. Yeah.
There was a joke about one of them, and Anna wouldn't mind me saying it now. And apparently he was walking down the corridor, and another staff member in our unit saw Anam walking down the corridor, and he was the director of the circumcision study. And they said, oh, you have to see Anam now. He walks upright. He pulls his collar right. It was just interesting, you know. He changed his, Anam doesn't look down anymore. He's walking down the corridor with the nice shoes and his collar upright. He's the director now.
That's right. So he's living up to his title. He's standing up proud and tall. And that's when we're talking about, because it is behavioral sciences that you studied, or that you're an expert in, it's understanding what is necessary to transform people's opinions and behaviors so that the behavior itself will change. If you don't give them the right titles, their head will constantly be down. Their heads will always be thinking, nobody's going to respect me. Whereas you give them the title, and
they have to play the role. Once they got the title, they have to play the role. They're either in or they are out. And they have to create the role. They have to dress the role up. They have to make it up. They have to, and if they're struggling, I was always there 24/7, and things happened, and I've had to defend them with my life in some instances, because it wasn't easy, The thing is, the laws went, but the attitude and behavior is still there.
Right.
The laws went, that's for sure. The laws went, but the microaggressions, which were really macroaggressions, continue. These spaces were not for us. The comic book story made it very clear. The space is not for you. We got to move you out, because you're not even an epidemiologist, right? You're a behavioral scientist. What's that?
Yeah.
You're not even a psychologist.
Yeah. You said something there which really got me thinking just now, which was the fact that one, you had to live up to it, but it was also the fact that the laws had gone, but the mindset was still there. Okay. And my question is kind of like surrounding that, to say, when we talk about the mindset was in 2 parts. The way in which the African Blacks viewed themselves, but also the way in which the white South Africans viewed them as well. So it was in 2 parts. And so you had to change the mindsets in 2 areas. It wasn't just one mindset had to change.
Well, perhaps that's the weakness of all my work.
Yeah.
Perhaps if you ask me what's the one big limitation, I think the big limitation is that I was way ahead of my time, but I did not know that. Number one. Number two is, in behavioral science, it's either an internal locus of control or an external locus of control. And my attitude was, I can't change the other people. you know, they in positions of power. I'm not even going to go and play there at all. I'm going to focus on my unit, my staff, our PhDs, candidates, directors, and that's what I did. So maybe I should have done both, but I don't think I was the right person to do the other part. I couldn't do both. There should have been another person to do the other part. That's sort of the one thing. The other thing is I was probably seen as quite anti-white, but then that would get blown out of the water because all these international people would come and they were all white except Ron Braithwaite. They were all white. So I didn't fit quite in. So yeah, I think I confused people maybe, but I had one mission, and that mission was I wanted to graduate 10 Black PhDs in 15 years, and I then did 16 or 17.
Wow. 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 That's a lot of work.
It was a lot of work.
That's a lot of work, a lot of projects, a lot of ideas to generate, a lot of people to train, maintain.
A lot of money to find.
Yeah. Wow. Guys, I'm going to open up the questioning. You know, I could continue questioning and asking questions. For me, it's a conversation. But is there anyone who would like to ask a question of Priscilla? If you raise your hands, right. Right, I'm just trying to see, I can see something in the chat. Marge, did you want to say anything?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, it's not even so many questions. I am just so blown away, Priscilla. I just want to say such an immense thank you. I think I will sound an idiot if I ask a question. I have no question. My chest is too filled with gratitude. Thank you and well done. And that's really it. Thank you very much for all that you have done and you continue to do. Thank you.
Thank you for saying that. Hopefully, in some way, I could help here as well, you know, because these things are, methodologies are pretty generic, aren't they? But thank you so much for acknowledging that.
Yeah. I think anyone would have had to recognize that the time frame in which you were working in terms of the climate of change in South Africa at the time, okay? I suppose that one of the questions that I would want to ask is, in all of the time that you were and are working there, what's the major changes that you have seen either in attitude or in outcomes across the time scale? So since the 1990s to now, what changes have you seen implemented, and how much further do you think that we need to go?
I think there are many, many changes. You know, we certainly have political power, not economic power. There's a major shift that has to go ahead in terms of economy, in terms of land, in terms of education for Black kids, in terms of university education for Black kids. I think a lot has been done, but we're no way even 25% there.
Wow. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done.
Yeah, a lot of work that needs to be done. And interestingly enough, you know, I just did during COVID, I did a small study there was money going, and then I wrote a grant to employ for a period of 8 to 10 months, 1,000 unemployed university graduates. And it's, you know, we did qualitative work with them and quantitative work with them as well. And it's just sad to see the findings, you know. I implemented the hopelessness scale, the, you know, various scales to measure aggression, discrimination, depression. So it's almost, I mean, I haven't done that. There isn't one paper published on that study yet. We're busy working on it, but it's almost like like, for every big step forward for a certain category of people, there's so many steps backward for a certain category of people.
Yeah.
So it's kind of on the top, and the upper levels are kind of evening out to an extent. But by now, in my opinion, we should have had many more Black PhDs, many more engineers, many more architects. Black people are the majority in the country,
Yeah. So despite the change, or the as you said, there's change in political power, but not necessarily so much change in the economic power as yet. That still needs to be worked on, and still greater opportunities need to come about for the majority of the population.
I'd argue that. And women are at the bottom of the rung now.
Women are at the bottom of the rung. Can you expand on that just slightly? This is kind of like I'm going to be wrapping up with this now.
So basically, during apartheid, right, our big struggle, and post-apartheid, our big struggle was about race. It was in your face.
Yeah.
So in a sense, even for me, women were like, the issue of gender was like not as high as race.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely not as high as race. And now I'm constantly doing some combination of the two.
Right.
And here's my thing about women. And we've done several studies, and you can talk to my PhDs as well. I think we really have to be careful in South Africa about the Black male child.
Right.
And we saw this in many studies. And just to give you crudely, like in the HIV studies, you see you empowering women to ask for the condom or whatever to be used, and they go home and they get beaten up. But you should, in fact, do both, right? Male and female, or both partners.
Yeah.
So something, I'm really concerned in South Africa about focusing on the girl child only. And as I'm sure many of the students here, and even yourself, would know, how much of violence against women there is in South Africa. And it's by our own people. It's our own brothers are doing this. It's our own uncles, our own fathers are doing this. Where did we leave them behind is my question. What happened? I don't know the answers. I mean, I've done some work in it, but I think there needs to be some very kind of progressive, different approaches.
Wow. You know what? You've just opened up a whole, we could start our conversation just from the point where of that, because the attitude of the male perspective, and only ever seeing it from the male perspectives, the male dominance, or that's what leads to the kind of discrimination, the kind of oppression, the oppression of women, which is what you're reporting and you're saying is happening. Because if you do then try to empower the woman, as you were saying, they're going to, are you disrespecting? It's not actually disrespecting, it's how much respect do the males have for the females, and how do we change that narrative?
Because if their self-esteem, if the boy child's self-esteem is so low, who are they going to kick first?
Yeah.
The one they perceive to be lowest, right? And that's Black women.
Yeah.
Or LGBTQ plus, or, that whole community as well. So I don't know. I think if I started a health promotion unit now, or I was given X amount of money to do behavioral science, I'd invite a whole lot of people, victims and perpetrators, to say, come tell me how to do this.
Wow. Priscilla, unfortunately, all good things must come to an end.
Yeah.
And this has been absolute. I know that I'm going to see you again. I know we're going to have much more conversations, because this has just been absolutely brilliant. I've absolutely loved our discussion, and there's so much I'm learning from you just by sitting here asking these questions. I've got, as I said, I've got these are my two final questions. I ask all of my guests, and it's what advice would you have given to your younger self? So what advice would you have given to your younger self? And the second piece of advice, or the second question is, what would you say would be, for your younger self looking at you now, would be the wow factor that they have?
My younger self, probably, you could have picked your battles better, one, and two, maybe you could have compromised a little without losing your value.
Yeah.
But remember, we came from a history of the ANC having the moral high ground, so you weren't going to compromise if you believed that. And then the other question, wow, now, I would say would be, my pride and glory would be all those PhDs that got trained and that can stand up in any public platform and defend whatever paper is in front of them. I think that is still, the research is by the by. The 140 odd publications is by the by. But it's the human spirit, the human involvement, the human development, for me, that would still be the wow factor, despite what my daughter says.
You know what, that brings us full circle, because you're a behavioral scientist. I would have been very surprised if you had said that was the publications, because what you want to see is the behavior. And so it's that acknowledgement that actually I've made a difference in the life, in the behavior of all of these people, and they will carry on making a difference in the lives of so many people to come.
And what I've benefited was in experience, in that feeling of the reward, you know, to see Sibu living in a wonderful place, his kids are in private school, you know, to see Anam's two little girls, you know, to see Anam in this great job. If he didn't have that PhD, he wouldn't have that freedom of mind and thought. And so it's at the end of the day, I think it's about the people.
Yeah, fantastic. Priscilla, I wanted to say another really big thank you for being our guest on Belonging today. And I know you had a bit of a cough, but you answered those questions with so much passion and understanding. It was absolutely brilliant. So I wanted to say another really big thank you. Okay.
Sure, Wayne, sure. And thanks to the audience for coming, and thanks to all the thanks. And thank you to you for inviting me as well. I did send you an email from Dorina. I forwarded you. Did you?
I wasn't sure if you wanted me to read it out, just or
no, you don't need to read it out. But I just wanted to know that you got it.
I got it. I did get it.
Thank you.
It was a beautiful email, and I can translate to that. I totally understand what it was saying. So that would be brilliant. So just before we go, I'm just going to let people know what we're going to be, who's our guest for next week. All right. So next week, we're going to have Bojensen Makumbin, and he's a volunteer and participations manager and a natural scientist and conservation educator. So he's going to be our guest next week. I believe he works at the Natural History Museum. So he's going to share some of his insights as an educator in natural sciences. Again, if you haven't seen any of the interviews, or if you'd like to catch up on or revisit some of the interviews that we've done in the past, then please go to our YouTube channel, which is tinyurl.com/belonging-IAO. And you'll be able to see, I think we're at 130 now, I'm not quite sure, but we're motoring on, and it's been excellent. Some of the highlights, move on from that. But as I say every week, it's about the guests, it's about their stories, it's about what their experience help us to understand about ourselves and how we all belong together. So I want to just say another big thank you for everyone, and I'll see you again next week. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Excellent, excellent.